there comes a certain age where not knowing, working on, and understanding the way your attachment style affects the way you show up in your adult relationships, not doing all that is not only a little bit irresponsible, it is like driving on the highway with no brakes and wondering why you can't slow down. And welcome back to the Percy Ponders Pod, which is a space for sensitive and thoughtful internet cousins to do life, love, and all the things together. So have you ever felt like you seem to like someone or want to chase someone more the less they seem to like you? Or that you repeatedly go for people who are physically distant, like they live across the country, across the world from you, rather than meeting people in your own community when there are good people to meet in your community? Or have you just noticed that you have a pattern of picking people who aren't the best pick for you when it comes to dating, right? And for one reason or another, you're like, that's my type. I'm trying to change my type, but I don't know how to change my type. Well, by the end of this podcast, e-cousins, we're going to get to the bottom of attachment styles, and specifically focusing on the anxious avoidant loop so that we can sort out some of the arts and sciences of knowing our patterns so that we can break them or interrupt them if they're not serving us anymore. And I'm not speaking about this from some removed, divorced, clinical way. I'm somebody who has had to work religiously on understanding some of my anxious patterns and healing my way toward more secure tendencies. So first, we'll do a quick rundown on attachment styles because not everyone knows that sort of thing. And then I want to focus for this video on how the anxious avoidant loop in dating and relationship shows up in toxic ways, and why it manifests and how it can be healthier. Okay, that's a lot. Let's get into it first. So I've heard a lot of people talk about attachment styles. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about attachment styles in a way that makes them make sense. Some people think your attachment style is your love language. It's not. It, in layman's terms, explains the way you love, why you love the way you love, and how you relate to a person or people in romantic situations and relationships, period. And all of those relational patterns are a product of how your primary caretakers related to you when you were a child and an infant and a toddler and all the younger ages than you currently are. It's pretty wild, one, how we don't realize the extent to which our early childhood programming shapes us. And so what I've learned is all our parents did the best they could with what they had, right? And they were mostly doing what they learned from their parents. And so can we see how that's flawed, right? That somewhere along the way, someone wasn't perfect, ruh-roh, right? And then it just kind of creates a snowball effect where it's like, okay, well, if this parent was codependent and then this father was super removed and always angry, and then the kid's there is like, oh, that's normal. Or I have friends who, they're a child of an alcoholic. And so they learned to be the kid who did the thing to keep dad or mom happy, right? You'll meet many entertainers who learned to be comedians because they just wanted to make their parent happy, right? So the first thing that's really helped me in my healing journey is understanding that rather than judging attachment styles as good or bad, like there's a lot of demonization of avoidant people, right? Is first understanding that our attachment styles are just adaptations, right? They are our baseline adaptations to whatever environment we found ourselves in when we were younger, right? So the gold standard, the ideal, is being securely attached, and that means that you were properly nurtured and cared for, and that you could trust your caretakers to show up for you in a way that was loving and caring and honored your feelings. And then you have more anxious people who weren't really sure if they could count on their caretakers, or things were here and there and everywhere. And so they learned that to get their needs met, they had to be very vocal about them or escalate, right? In ways that allow their needs to be met. And those people tend to show up in very clingy ways or seeking more reassurance in relationships. And then avoidant people, right? They might have learned pretty early on that, okay, your needs don't quite matter here, or your feelings are invalid here. We don't do feelings in this house, right? I know a lot of men who had stoic fathers and whatnot, and they learned we don't do feelings in this house. And so they learned to be very self-reliant on the surface, but crave connection deep down inside and struggle with accessing the level of depth and connection they want in their relationships, because they often do things that sabotage the connections that they truly crave, because they're afraid of feeling engulfed or enmeshed or smothered, right? And then, I know this is a mouthful, stick with me here, and I want to get to the anxious avoidant loop because that's where it gets really interesting. And then you have disorganized attachment, which is where some people might have had an abusive household, or they might have had a household where affection, care, and all the things that gave them a sense of grounding were very hot and cold. And so these people vacillate between craving lots of intimacy and closeness, but also like disorganized around it, right? It's back and forth, hot and cold. And so that bookends attachment theory and attachment styles. Call me radical, call me unhinged, but there comes a certain age where not knowing, working on, and understanding the way your attachment style affects the way you show up in your adult relationships, not doing all that, is not only a little bit irresponsible, it is like driving on the highway with no brakes and wondering why you can't slow down. It is like driving down a hill with no brakes and wondering why you keep crashing into the cars in front of you. And why is that? Because unless you were graced and privileged with the sort of upbringing that rendered you securely attached, your attachment issues, when unhealed, will lead you to bleed on people who did not cut you. They will sabotage very promising and healthy connections because your nervous system is not ready for them. Your nervous system does not know how to discern who is safe versus who's unsafe, right? That I've met a lot of avoidant people who, because they have not worked on their avoidant attachment, they're triggered by very healthy relationship and relational activities like communication and getting to know people and interdependence. Like interdependence is a part of relating to another person, right? That's bleeding on people who didn't cut you, right? The people who cut you are, unfortunately, who you were raised with, and it wasn't malicious, but that's the effect that attachment wounds have later on in life, right? Or I know anxious people who will sabotage connections by requesting too much too soon, right? That you don't need to text all day, every day when you just met somebody, right? You and that person led their 20, their 30, their 40 years independently just fine before they met you. And here you are, a date or two in, it's okay to have a little breathing room in between, right? In between the communications, right? That's all right. That's normal. They're still kind of working you into their life and you're working them into your life. And it's okay for that process to be relatively gradual. And I found that many of the healthier relationships, connections that bloom tend to have a bit more of a gradual way about them. There are exceptions, but they're rare. So this is why it's important to know attachment stuff. Because if you don't know your attachment style, right, like you're going to bleed on people who didn't cut you. You are going to see smoke and fire where there is a clear blue sky in a beautiful abode, in a green lush meadow with nothing but cute bunnies, right, and daisies surrounding the cottage. You're going to see danger where there's none if you don't do the work to heal. And when I tell you there are so many people, especially men out here in these streets, who aren't doing a jot, an ounce of attachment work, yet without flinching are hopping out into these streets and dating and bouncing from person to person or wondering why it's not working. And it's like, my guy, my girl, not your cousin. Have you considered your attachment situation, right? So with that, we've laid the groundwork. Let's talk the anxious avoidant loop. Have you noticed how if you spend any time on the internet and you've heard people talk about attachment styles, right? I love talking about this stuff, by the way, that there tends to be a demonization of avoidantly attached people, right? And a victimization of more anxiously attached people. That the avoidantly attached person is seen as big bad wolf. An anxious person or person who wants more care and connection is seen as meek, mild, tender lamb. And that binary is unwell, right? That is not exactly how it goes. Where does that come from? Where does that villainization of avoidant attached person come from? It comes from the fact that the person who is able to withdraw the most from a connection, the person who is most comfortable not talking for days or weeks or months on end, the person who can appear unfazed because they are most withdrawn, in a sense, has more power in the connection because they are controlling the pace and the speed of how two people are relating to each other, right? And so a number of people with unhealed avoidant tendencies can do some really hurtful things in the spirit of self-protection. Many years ago, before I started really doing attachment work, I found myself in a relationship with a very avoidant person. And I realized it too late. It was too little too late. It really was. But the kicker for me was, wow, okay, this person was just like their parent, just like their dad, right? Didn't like to express affection, was cold but standoffish in the romance department. There was never a right time to have the important conversations about the relationship. And so they'd get pushed to late at night, and that would cause conflicts because this isn't the right time. And now the next day is ruined because we had a hard conversation at midnight. And it's like, well, look, you've been dodging me all day and the past several weeks. And so we haven't talked about these things. And so I realized how, wow, in this situation, the avoidant person is really controlling the pace of this connection in a way that is really hurtful. And so I understand why avoidants get that reputation. However, avoidants are people too. They hurt too. And they learn to be that hyper independent, afraid of being enmeshed, afraid of being smothered the way they are, because they weren't taught to be comfortable with their feelings and weren't taught to rely on others as a kid. Not fully, right? And so that shows up in relationships. And for the avoidant, a big part of the work is getting comfortable, okay? Sitting with your discomfort and leaning into communication, leaning into repair after rupture with your partner, because that's what people who care do. That's what mature adults do. They don't just flee and shut down because their defense mechanisms are doing what defense mechanisms do. You know what I'm saying? And then as for anxious people aren't just tendered mild lambs, right? Anxious people can also cause hurt and harm. Anxious people can be very demanding in ways that is just unfair to other people. That anxiety can manifest in ways that makes people very controlling of the dynamic, very insistent on talking about everything right now. And it's like, no, actually the work of an anxious person is to learn how to self-soothe too. The work of a recovering anxious person is to figure out how to sit with some of your discomfort, right? How to self-regulate and maybe have the conversation when you're not fuming, right? Because you're going to say things in the heat of the moment when you're really angry and agitated that you might regret, right? So around this conversation of anxious and avoidant, you might be wondering, Travis, why aren't we talking about the other attachment styles? Well, two of the more common attachment styles are anxious and avoidant. Let me know down in the comments what your experience is with this, by the way, and if you'd like me to cover more on the others, I'm happy to do that. I have resources. I coach folks through big transitions in life, and I bring in awareness of psychology and attachment theory to how we approach these problems. So you can learn more about that down below. But with regard to the anxious avoidant dynamic, that is a very popular one, and that's why we're talking about that dynamic here to kick this conversation off, right? And why is it that anxious and avoidance tend to be drawn to each other, thick as thieves, like, you know, the polar opposite sides of the magnet that connect? Or maybe it's not the polar opposite sides that connect. Let's think of a better analogy. Let me know down in the comments, right? But the point is that anxious and avoidant people tend to be drawn to each other because one person is more the go-getter, the chaser, and the other person is more the, I like to be chased. I like to feel wanted, right? I want connection, but I don't really want connection. That's the avoidant person. And so it creates this loop, this cyclical loop, where as soon as they feel close, then the avoidant pulls away. As soon as they pull away, then the anxious person kind of chases. And then it creates a real interesting vicious cycle. All this to say, is it possible for anxious and avoidance to heal? Is it possible for any attachment style to heal? Absolutely. There is a way, back to our car analogy, of taking your car to the mechanic, which is, say, going to therapy, of plugging into resources like this, of reading, getting your brakes fixed, so you're not out here being reckless in these streets with people's hearts and feelings, and work on your attachment issues. You can work on them. You can heal your way towards secure tendencies. As an avoidant, you can heal your way toward learning how to express your feelings without shutting down, lean into conflict without blowing up, right? Navigate the different stages of getting to know people without being hurtful and cold and dismissive. Because we don't talk about avoidant people can be very dismissive. At your worst, you can. And anxious people can learn to self-regulate and be sovereign within yourself, dependent of how other people are showing up, right? And to come from a more grounded place with your communication rather than a frantic place of insisting on always having things your way and craving an ungodly amount of reassurance that no person can give you. You know what I'm saying? If you know what I'm saying, let me know that you know what I'm saying. Okay? I want to know more about what you think on this topic. I want to know more about what you think your attachment style is, and if at all you've been healing this, let me know. E-Cousins, we keep it real. We aspire to work on the parts of ourselves that need to evolve. Because why not? Why stagnate, right? Life's too short. And the highest expression of self-love and love for others is a willingness to look in the mirror and to consider the ways that we can be better versions of ourselves. Not out of self-hate, not because you need to tweak and modify everything, but because there are certain parts of us that won't serve what we want to call in, right? What we want to call in for ourselves in our relationships. We want to call in for ourselves in our friendships. We want to call in for ourselves in so many areas. So again, resources down below. Get in touch if you want to book a session to talk more about the coaching program, where folks are coming to facilitate transformation, to get unstuck, and to really step into that next level of flow and alignment in your relationships and work. Let me know about that. Talk soon. And if you could rate and review this pod as well, that would be awesome.